Hello, friends. Today we will tell you about the life of peasants in medieval Europe. With the arrival of the first spring days, fieldwork began in the villages. After the winter break, peasants started preparing the land for sowing. Fields left fallow required plowing. For this purpose, they used heavy wooden plows with iron blades, pulled by oxen. The process was slow and labor-intensive, as the soil often remained damp after the snow melted. Simultaneously with plowing, sowing began. Peasants went out to the fields with bags of grain and scattered it by hand. The main crops were rye, oats, and barley. Legumes such as peas and lentils also occupied an important place in the sowings. After scattering the seeds, they were covered with soil using primitive harrows, or simply trampled into the ground by livestock. While the men worked in the fields, women and children tended to the kitchen gardens near their homes. In small plots, they planted cabbage, turnips, onions, garlic, and other vegetables. These plantings were vital as they provided peasants with food until the next harvest. Gardens were fenced with wattle to protect them from animals. At the same time, feudal lords or their stewards checked the peasants' readiness to work on the lord's lands. Peasants were obligated to perform corvée labor, a set number of days each year spent working on fields belonging to the village's owner. Failure to fulfill corvée duties could result in punishments. Monasteries also began their spring work on their estates. Monks oversaw plantings in gardens and vegetable plots, paying special attention to medicinal herbs. Part of the harvest from monastic lands went to feed the brethren, while another part was sold or distributed to the needy. The spring season was stressful, as the future harvest depended on the timeliness and quality of the work. The weather could interfere. Prolonged rains hindered plowing, and late frosts destroyed young crops. Peasants prayed for good weather, but their lives remained hard and uncertain. Thus, spring in a medieval village was a time of great hopes and back-breaking labor. Everyone, from the simple farmer to the feudal lord, depended on how successfully the critical fieldwork of this season would proceed. With summer's arrival, peasant work did not become easier. The primary task of this season was weed control, which threatened the harvest. Adults and children manually weeded fields, spending hours under scorching sun. This monotonous work repeated several times during summer as weeds regrew rapidly. The most important summer event was haymaking. In late June, early July, when grasses reached peak growth, the entire village gathered in meadows. Men cut grass with sharp scythes. Women and adolescents raked it for drying, while elders and children stacked hay into ricks. Hay quality directly impacted livestock's winter survival. Simultaneously, peasants had to mow lords' meadows as part of feudal obligations. Forests became supplementary food sources during summer. Women gathered berries, wild strawberries, bilberries, raspberries, which were dried for winter or consumed fresh. Children foraged for edible plants. Sorrel, wild onions, nettles, mushrooms found in woods supplemented diets, though some varieties were avoided due to poisoning risks. Livestock grazed on communal pastures during summer months. Adolescents and elders monitored animals to prevent trespassing on lords' lands or crop damage. Morning and evening milking provided essential nutrition, with surplus milk processed into simple cheeses or salted butter for preservation. Summer weather often brought challenges. Prolonged rains could flatten crops. while droughts caused premature ripening and poor yields. Peasants particularly feared hailstorms that could destroy months of labor within minutes. Villages would then seek priestly intervention through weather-related prayers. Nobility conducted hunts in their domains during this season. Though hunting remained aristocratic privilege, peasants occasionally trapped small game, hares or birds, with snares. Such meat provided rare supplements to predominantly plant-based diets. Monastic economies reached peak activity in summer. Monks harvested medicinal herbs, tended beehives, and maintained fish ponds. Some produce served monastic needs, while surplus was traded for other necessities. Thus, summer for medieval peasants meant continuous labor, simultaneously securing fodder, tending crops, and utilizing nature's bounty. Summer's success directly determined the village's ability to survive the coming winter. With the arrival of autumn came the most crucial period, the harvest. Winter crops ripened first. Peasants went into the fields with sickles to begin reaping. Work continued from dawn till dusk as timing was critical. Women cut the stalks, while men bound them into sheaves. Children helped gather fallen grains. After harvesting, the sheaves were transported to the threshing floor, a special area for grain processing. Here, grain was separated from straw using flails. This labor-intensive task required physical strength and was performed primarily by men. The grain was then winnowed by tossing it with shovels into the wind to remove chaff. Simultaneously with grain harvesting, vegetable crops were gathered from kitchen gardens. Turnips, cabbages, and onions were dug up manually. Some vegetables were consumed immediately, while others were stored in special pits or cellars. Particular attention was given to cabbage. It was fermented in large barrels to preserve vitamins for winter. An important autumn obligation was paying feudal dues. Peasants surrendered a significant portion of their harvest, typically about 1/3. The grain was weighed and transported to the lord's granaries. Failure to meet obligations resulted in fines or corporal punishment. The forest continued providing supplemental resources. Mushrooms were dried on special wicker racks. Acorns and nuts supplemented meager winter diets. Oak bark was occasionally ground into flour and mixed with rye during crop failures. Livestock was gradually transitioned from pastures to winter shelters. Decisions were made about which animals to slaughter. Meat was salted or smoked, offal used for sausages, and hides processed for clothing. Monasteries actively prepared for winter during this period. Monks processed harvests, filled storage rooms, and maintained inventory records. Some produce was distributed to the poor as alms. Autumn concluded with sowing winter crops. Peasants returned to the fields to ensure next year's harvest, working until the first frosts in a race against the approaching cold. Today we will examine in detail the winter period in the lives of medieval peasants, paying special attention to their daily concerns, living conditions, and survival strategies during the cold season. With the arrival of winter, all agricultural work ceased completely. The short daylight hours, low temperatures, and frequent snowfalls forced peasants to spend most of their time in their dwellings. A typical peasant hut was a simple one-room structure with an earthen floor, low ceilings, and an open hearth located in the center of the room. Smoke from the hearth escaped through a special hole in the roof, creating constant smokiness inside the dwelling. The walls were usually built of logs or wattle and daub. while roofs were thatched or covered with shingles. The primary winter occupation was maintaining warmth in the home. Firewood was prepared in advance throughout summer and autumn, but there was never enough. The fire in the hearth was kept burning continuously, day and night, as restarting it without modern means was extremely difficult. During particularly severe frosts, young livestock, lambs, calves, or piglets, might be kept inside the house to protect them from freezing. This created additional discomfort, but was necessary to preserve future livestock. The winter diet was extremely meager and monotonous, consisting mainly of coarsely ground bread, baked every few weeks and stored in special wooden chests. Various grain porridges, oat, barley and pea, sauerkraut, and turnips prepared in large quantities during autumn. Small amounts of salted and smoked meat, rationed for holidays. Dried herbs and mushrooms collected during summer, dried fish and salted herring in coastal regions. Dairy products were a rare luxury in winter, as cows produced very little milk in cold weather. What little milk could be obtained was usually processed into butter or hard cheeses for longer preservation. These products were saved for special occasions or sold at market to obtain money for tax payments. Craft work constituted an important part of winter activities and helped peasants prepare for the new agricultural season. Men repaired and made agricultural tools, plows, harrows, carts, engaged in basket weaving and wooden utensil repair, built sledges and other winter transport. Women spun wool, wove cloth, sewed and mended clothing, made candles and other necessary utensils. Children helped with chores and gradually learned crafts from elders. Special attention was paid to preserving grain stores during winter. They were regularly checked for mold, insect pests, or rodents. At the slightest sign of spoilage, grain was immediately sorted, damaged kernels removed, and the remainder dried. Granaries were additionally insulated with straw and ventilated during relatively warm days. During relatively warm and clear winter days, peasants engaged in additional preparations. Harvesting ice from rivers and lakes, ice was sawn or chopped and stored in deep pits layered with straw. This ice was used in summer to cool perishable foods. Gathering firewood for the next season by collecting deadwood in nearby forests. Cleaning and repairing wells, roads, and outbuildings. Winter holidays and rituals provided rare entertainment and temporary respite from monotonous daily life. Christmas, Yuletide, and Shrovetide were celebrated by the entire community. On these occasions, people allowed themselves slightly more food, sometimes even meat dishes. Young people organized festivities, fortune-telling, and other traditional entertainments. However, even during celebrations, peasants remembered the need to conserve supplies. Monasteries continued their activities during winter, receiving pilgrims and the needy. Monks conducted regular services, copied books, and practiced various crafts. Part of the monastic stores were distributed to the poor as hot soup or bread. Monastic hospitals provided care for the sick and frostbitten. Special attention was paid to maintaining warmth in churches and scriptoriums. Nobility and feudal lords held lavish feasts and hunted wolves, foxes, and other game during winter. Peasants were sometimes permitted to participate in these hunts as beaters or helpers, for which they might receive portions of the game or food. More often, however, noble winter entertainments only increased peasant obligations, as they had to provide food for feasts and fodder for hunting dogs. Winter was a harsh survival test for entire peasant families. The weak, sick, and elderly often didn't live to see spring. Child mortality was especially high. Many children couldn't withstand the cold, malnutrition, and diseases. Peasants carefully monitored their remaining supplies, daily calculating whether they would last until the new harvest. Every extra handful of grain or piece of bread could prove decisive in the family's struggle for survival. Famine was a constant threat to medieval society. Crop failures caused by adverse weather conditions, wars, or epidemics could lead to catastrophic consequences. When grain reserves were depleted, peasants were forced to resort to extreme measures for survival. The first sign of impending famine was the reduction of daily rations. Instead of the usual 2 meals, they switched to 1. Bread, normally the dietary staple, was replaced with cheaper substitutes. Acorns, tree bark, goosefoot, and other plant additives were mixed into flour. These mixtures were poorly digested and often caused gastrointestinal problems. When traditional food sources were exhausted, peasants turned to natural resources. Roots, wild herbs, and tree bark were gathered in forests. Elm and birch bark were particularly valued, dried and ground into flour. Acorns, soaked to remove bitterness, were also used to make bread. These foods had low nutritional value, but provided some relief from hunger. The animal kingdom also became a food source. Peasants caught small rodents, birds, even hedgehogs and frogs. Rivers and lakes were scoured for any available fish, including small species normally avoided. Insects, especially locusts in southern regions, were consumed. These extreme measures reflected utter desperation. The social consequences of famine were severe. Mortality rates spiked, particularly among children and the elderly. Many peasants abandoned their homes and migrated to towns or neighboring regions in search of food. Theft of provisions increased despite harsh punishments. Some sold their last possessions or even family members into servitude for food. Feudal lords reacted differently to these crises. Some reduced taxes or distributed grain from their reserves, understanding that without peasants, their lands would go untilled. Others tightened control over remaining supplies, fearing uprisings. In extreme cases, peasants raided manor granaries, often meeting brutal reprisals. The church played a key role in famine relief. Monasteries organized soup kitchens and bread distributions at their gates. However, these reserves were insufficient for all. Clergy appealed to wealthy townsfolk for charity, with little response. Simultaneously, the church framed famine as divine punishment for sins, helping maintain social order. Cities became magnets for starving peasants, but conditions there were dire. Bread prices soared tenfold. Municipal authorities imposed grain trade restrictions to curb speculation. Bakers were mandated to sell bread at fixed prices under threat of severe punishment. Desperate crowds gathered in squares, sometimes erupting into bread riots. Meat merchants and luxury food traders suffered losses during famines. Demand for their goods plummeted, as all funds were diverted to bread. Some butchers sold offal and scraps at reduced prices, but even these were unaffordable for many. The medical consequences were horrific. Nutrient deficiencies led to dystrophy, scurvy, and other diseases. Weakened bodies became vulnerable to infections. Child mortality reached catastrophic levels. Some villages lost a third of their children in bad years. Famines impacted demography. Birth rates declined as chronic malnutrition caused female infertility. Many youths abandoned their homelands, leaving entire villages deserted. Medieval chronicles document numerous great famines. The worst occurred in 1315 to 1317, when crop failures across Europe caused mass mortality. Some regions reported cannibalism, though the church vehemently condemned the practice. Peasants developed survival strategies. They meticulously preserved seed grain, even at the cost of their own health. Some secretly buried grain reserves against marauders. Certain families maintained emergency famine stores for absolute crises. Beyond physical suffering, famine caused profound psychological trauma. Oral traditions preserved tales of lean years as cautionary tales, shaping a cultural reverence for food. Notably, famines highlighted medieval solidarity. Neighbors shared their last morsels and took in orphaned children. Such cooperation helped communities endure the worst hardships. Famine years tested the feudal system itself, exposing the fragility of social order and every estate's dependence on peasant labor. Severe crises sometimes prompted adjustments to duties or land relations, though systemic reform remained impossible. The challenge of preserving food was critical for medieval society's survival. Without modern preservation technologies, peasants, feudal lords, and monasteries developed comprehensive methods to store harvests until the next season. Grain storage presented the greatest difficulties. Wooden granaries, specially designed to protect against rodents and moisture, served as primary storage. Elevated floors rested on stone or wooden foundations, while double-walled structures used clay insulation. Grain was kept in barrels or special chests, layered with straw or ash for moisture absorption. Larger operations utilized 2 to 3 meter deep storage pits lined with clay and insulated with straw. The process of grain storage required constant monitoring. Peasants regularly checked for signs of mold, insect infestation, or rodent activity. Special attention was paid to the moisture content, as damp grain could ferment or sprout, ruining entire stores. Vegetables required particular conditions. Cabbages hung in cellars or fermented in barrels. Turnips and carrots were buried in sand-filled pits that maintained stable humidity levels. Onions and garlic were braided and hung in dry, well-ventilated areas to prevent rotting. Monasteries built specialized stone root cellars with sophisticated ventilation systems that allowed precise control of temperature and humidity. These underground storage spaces often featured multiple chambers for different types of produce, with some monasteries maintaining separate cellars for medicinal herbs and kitchen vegetables. Meat preservation employed several methods. Salting was most common. Meat was packed in salt-filled barrels or brine solutions, with larger cuts often being first rubbed with salt mixtures containing herbs and spices. Wealthier households smoked meat in dedicated chambers where the type of wood used, oak, apple, or beech, imparted distinct flavors. Lard was rendered and stored in clay pots, sealed with cloth and wax. Northern regions utilized natural freezing in unheated spaces, though this method was unreliable during warmer winters. The preservation process often began immediately after slaughter, with butchers working quickly to prepare meat for storage before spoilage could begin. Fish was primarily salt-cured in a process that could take several weeks. Herring and cod were layered in barrels with coarse salt, creating stocks that could last a year or more. Coastal communities air-dried fish on wooden racks in specially designed drying sheds that allowed sea breezes to circulate. Smoked fish remained a delicacy for affluent classes, with different smoking techniques producing everything from lightly smoked salmon to heavily smoked sturgeon. River fish were often preserved live in submerged cages or ponds until needed, providing fresh options when available. Dairy products needed specialized processing. Milk was fermented into curds or sour milk using wooden vessels that retained beneficial bacteria. Cheeses made with rennet were salted and dried on wooden racks in cool, dark cellars. Butter was clarified and sealed under salt layers in ceramic containers, preserving it for months. Some monasteries developed advanced aging techniques for cheeses, creating early versions of what we now recognize as aged or blue cheeses. Whey, a byproduct of cheesemaking, was often used in baking or as a base for soups to minimize waste. Fruits and berries were dried on special frames or in bread ovens' residual heat. Apples and pears were preserved in saltwater barrels or sometimes honey solutions when available. Monasteries made honey-preserved jams, though this costly method was uncommon outside wealthy establishments. Some fruits were converted into alcoholic beverages like ciders or perries as an alternative preservation method. Dried fruits became particularly important winter sources of vitamins and could be reconstituted in water for cooking. First, village markets and local exchange. Within peasant communities, an elaborate barter system existed. Surplus products like eggs, dairy, vegetables, or wool were exchanged between neighbors without money. Typical exchanges included a dozen eggs for a measure of peas, a sheepskin for a clay pot, a chicken for an iron sickle. These transactions were recorded by the village elder and accounted for in communal duties. Particularly important was the exchange of seed grain between households, maintaining crop biodiversity. Second regional fairs, major fairs, occurred several times annually, typically coinciding with religious holidays. The most significant included summer grain fairs, June-July, autumn livestock fairs, September-October, spring tool fairs, March-April. Merchants traveled 100 to 150 kilometers using pack animals and carts, with trade caravans averaging 20 to 25 kilometers daily. Fairs maintained strict measurement systems supervised by urban authorities. Third urban market organization, weekly city markets, typically Thursdays or Saturdays, featured permanent stone stalls for butchers and bakers, wooden stands for peasant sellers, dedicated sections for perishables, inspector-controlled scales and measures, municipal regulations included, price ceilings during shortages, bread and meat quality standards, operating hours, usually dawn to noon. 4. Trade routes and transport. Major land routes included salt roads, e.g. Lüneburg to northern Germany, grain routes, Poland to Western Europe, wine roads, Bordeaux to England. River transport cost 5 to 7 times less than overland. Key waterways: Rhine, wine, grain, Danube, salt, livestock. Seine, fish, cheese. Maritime trade was conducted by Hanseatic League, herring, grain, wax, Italian republics, spices, olive oil. 5. Social dimensions of trade guilds regulated, apprenticeships, 7 years for butchers, pricing and purchase quotas, professional admission standards. Conflicts arose between urban guilds and rural producers, local and foreign merchants, wholesalers and retailers. 6. Monastic commerce. Major abbeys engaged in grain and wine surplus sales, Wool exports, especially Cistercians. Premium cheese production. Medicinal herb trade monasteries often provided credit using grain receipts, precursors to modern bills of exchange. Seasonal variations, price fluctuations followed harvest cycles. Grain, cheapest post-harvest, rising by spring vegetables, seasonal availability only. Meat, cheapest after autumn slaughter. Fish, dependent on liturgical calendar 8. Quality control systems, inspection protocols included. Mandatory bread testing, slaughterhouse meat examinations, bi-monthly measurement verification, fraud penalties, including public humiliation. 9. Specialized marketplaces, major cities maintained separate. Grain markets, meat halls, fish wharves, salt yards, wine storehouses. 10. Crisis management. During shortages, grain exports were banned. Speculative hoards confiscated. Municipal granaries activated price ceilings enforced. 11. Climate impacts. The Little Ice Age, 14th to 19th centuries, caused trade route reductions, grain price inflation, crop pattern changes, increased northern sea trade balance scales, standardized grain liquid barrels, fabric measurement sticks, counting boards for large transactions. 13. Taxation systems, merchants paid, market tolls, road tariffs, bridge fees, customs duties, guild levies. 14. Food security measures, cities developed. Strategic reserve systems, emergency supply plans, trade route controls, official supplier networks. 15. Evolving practices. By the late Middle Ages, commodity exchanges emerged. Credit systems expanded. Written contracts proliferated. Regional specialization increased. The daily existence of a medieval peasant revolved around a grain-based diet. Dark rye or barley bread, consumed in quantities up to 2 kilograms per adult laborer daily, formed the nutritional foundation. It was supplemented by thick gruels of oats, barley, or legumes, enhanced seasonally with cabbage, turnips, onions, or wild greens. The morning meal often consisted of leftovers from the evening stew or bread with onions, while the main repast occurred in the afternoon after returning from the fields. Meat appeared rarely, primarily in autumn after livestock slaughter as salted meat or lard, carefully preserved for winter months. Dairy products like sour milk, curds, or cheese were accessible mainly in summer when livestock produced more milk. Winter fare narrowed to bread, sauerkraut, pulses, and rare inclusions of salted fish or meat, transforming the cold season into a constant struggle against malnutrition and vitamin deficiency. Monastic meals, in contrast, exhibited predictability and deliberation, governed by monastic rules and the ecclesiastical calendar. 2 main meals, dinner and supper, included bread, boiled vegetables, legume dishes, and cheese. Fish, often salted herring or locally caught river fish, substituted for meat during numerous fast days. Brewing was integral to monastic economies, providing brethren with low-alcohol beverages safer than untreated water. Monastery kitchen gardens, true hubs of agronomic knowledge, supplied not only vegetables but also diverse aromatic and medicinal herbs, mint, sage, caraway, dill, used both to flavor simple dishes and maintain health according to humoral theory. The Cistercians, renowned for their vast estates, elevated cheesemaking to an art, producing aged cheeses that became trade commodities and income sources. Strict fasts, especially Lent, drastically reduced rations to bread, water, and basic vegetable dishes, viewed not only as spiritual exercises, but also as physiological detoxification. Urban environments fostered distinct dietary dynamics. Market access afforded townsfolk more varied, though not necessarily higher quality, tables. Artisans and merchants could afford white wheat bread, fresh meat from butchers' guild shops, imported salted fish, and even exotic spices like pepper or saffron in small quantities. The urban poor, however, often ate worse than peasants, reliant on cheap low-grade bread, grain porridges, kitchen scraps from wealthy households, and charity distributions from monasteries or civic authorities. Street food, meat pies, roasted poultry, pea cakes fed those without hearths. Public taverns became social centers where conversations flourished and deals were struck over ale or wine. Municipal authorities strictly regulated bread prices and meat quality, fearing hunger riots, especially in lean years. Bakers caught cheating on weight or adulterating flour faced harsh punishments, including confinement in the pillory with spoiled bread tied around their necks. Aristocratic cuisine transformed dining into theater of power and wealth. Lavish feasts with dozens of dishes served as demonstrations of the host's status. Game meats, venison, boar, fowl, occupied center stage, generously seasoned with costly spices attesting to extensive trade networks. Complex sauces based on wine, vinegar, crushed nuts, and spices masked the taste of meat beginning to spoil, a problem in the absence of reliable refrigeration. Elaborate subtleties, illusion foods like pâtés shaped as castles or roasted peacocks refeathered, astonished guests with culinary artistry. Service followed strict rituals, from ceremonial hand-washing before meals to intricate meat-carving protocols. White bread, sugar, almonds, and sweet wines were symbols of luxury. Meals were accompanied by music and performances, with leftovers often distributed to the poor gathered at castle gates, reinforcing the Lord's generosity and Christian charity. The religious calendar profoundly shaped all classes' diets. Over 150 fast days annually, every Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Advent, Lent, and other periods, strictly forbade meat and animal fats. Fish, especially cheap salted herring, became the primary protein source. Monasteries and affluent townsfolk could afford diverse Lenten fare. Almond milk instead of dairy, expensive freshwater fish, refined fish pâtés, fruits and syrup. For the poor, fasting often meant subsisting on meager rations of bread, onions, beans, and sauerkraut. The pre-Easter Lenten fast was the strictest and longest, compelling even nobles to simple fare. However, church feasts, Christmas, Easter, patron saints' days, became times of festive abundance when social norms relaxed, and even peasants might partake of meat and heartier meals. Regional variations were dictated by climate and resources. In Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and Britain, diets centered on barley, rye, cabbage, root vegetables, and abundant fish, especially herring and cod. Dairy products, butter, cheeses, skyr, played key roles. Mediterranean lands were ruled by the Trinity: wheat as bread and pasta, olive oil and wine, vegetables, fruits, sheep and goat cheeses, and fish supplemented the table. Alpine and Pyrenean mountain regions relied on animal husbandry. Cheeses, especially hard, aged varieties, cured meats, and butter formed dietary staples, complemented by rye bread and seasonal forest bounty. Eastern Europe, the Slavic lands, featured greater grain diversity, millet, buckwheat, abundance of mushrooms, honey, fermented vegetables, especially cabbage, the precursor to shchi, and widespread use of sour cream. Medieval culinary culture, despite apparent simplicity, displayed remarkable adaptability and accumulated wisdom. Knowledge of seasonal cycles, mastery of preservation, salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, skill in utilizing wild plants, and complex systems of food taboos and prescriptions all enabled society to survive amid harvest instability and limited technology. Food was not merely sustenance, but a marker of social status, religious affiliation, and local identity. The experience of medieval cuisine, particularly in fermentation, cheese-making, baking, and resource efficiency, laid foundations for many modern European culinary traditions, reminding us of the deep connection between survival, culture, and daily labor in a distant era. We were very interested in how different the food in Europe was from the food in Arab countries at that time. That's how things stood. Medieval European and Arab foodways. A comparative analysis. The dietary foundations of medieval Europe centered on cereal grains adapted to regional climates. Wheat dominated southern regions, while rye prevailed in eastern territories and barley with oats sustained northern populations. Dark bread made from rye or barley flour, often supplemented by acorns or roots during shortages, formed the staple for commoners. White wheat bread remained an elite privilege. Turnips, cabbages, and onions constituted primary vegetables, with peas and lentils providing crucial plant-based proteins. In Arab territories, agricultural practices focused on drought-resistant species. Rice formed the basis of dishes like pilaf, durum wheat yielded couscous, and date palms supplied both caloric sustenance and natural sweeteners. Citrus orchards produced lemons and bitter oranges essential for flavoring, while eggplant emerged as a versatile culinary ingredient across the caliphates. Meat consumption patterns revealed profound cultural divergences. European nobility consumed game such as venison, wild boar, and ornamental birds like peacocks, though Christian fasting regulations prohibited animal products for approximately 150 days annually, mandating fish, particularly salted herring, as substitutes. Islamic dietary laws established distinct parameters: pork prohibition, ritual slaughter dabaha, and halal certification. Mutton, goat, and camel meats dominated Arabian tables, with coastal communities incorporating fish and seafood. The religious framework extended to alcohol prohibition in Muslim societies, stimulating development of non-alcoholic alternatives like sherbets, fruit syrups mixed with snow, and fermented dairy drinks such as ayran, while Europeans relied on beer, wine, and cider as daily beverages and water purification methods. Food preservation technologies reflected environmental adaptations. Europeans employed salt curing, smoking, and fermentation for vegetables like sauerkraut, storing grains in clay-insulated granaries. Limited transportation infrastructure restricted access to fresh produce beyond local regions. Arab societies leveraged advanced irrigation systems, including qanats, underground channels, and narayas, water wheels, to enable year-round cultivation. Spices functioned dualistically as flavor enhancers and preservatives in hot climates. Culinary innovations like mutabak, layered meat pies, demonstrated sophisticated spicing techniques, while rosewater-infused desserts exemplified Persian culinary influences. Socio-religious structures shaped consumption hierarchies. European sumptuary laws enforced dietary segregation. Peasant diets featured porridges and vegetable stews, while aristocratic feasts showcased exotic spices and multi-course spectacles. Medical theories promoted spices as digestive aids, though their cost maintained elite exclusivity. Islamic societies observed unified dietary rules across classes, with charitable practices zakat mitigating food insecurity. Physician scholars like Ibn Sina systematized nutritional science, documenting health benefits of almonds, pomegranates, and dates while establishing dietetics as medical discipline. Transcontinental exchanges transformed both culinary traditions. Crusaders introduced rice, citrus, sugar, and eggplant to Europe from Arab territories, with spices becoming luxury status symbols. Arab culinary arts absorbed Persian techniques like rosewater distillation and Byzantine soup preparations, shorba, while trade networks imported Chinese tea and Indian spices. Agricultural technologies, including terrace farming and windmills, spread from Muslim regions to Mediterranean Europe, revolutionizing crop yields. Long-term impacts manifested asymmetrically. Arab innovations in irrigation, distillation, and spice integration fundamentally altered European agriculture and cuisine by the late medieval period. Sugar cultivation transferred from Persia to Sicily, while rice transformed Italian wetlands. Conversely, European spice demand stimulated maritime exploration, but failed to achieve the democratized usage seen in Arab societies, where spices permeated daily cooking rather than merely ceremonial meals. The comparison reveals how environmental constraints and religious frameworks generated distinct food systems. Europe's grain-dependent, seasonally fluctuating model contrasted with Arabia's irrigated oasis agriculture and year-round fresh produce availability. Religious prescriptions proved more influential than geography. Christian fasting cycles versus Islamic halal jurisprudence created divergent protein sources and meal structures. Arab advancements in agronomy, dietetics, and preservation techniques exerted lasting global influence, while Europe's socially stratified consumption patterns foreshadowed modern dietary inequalities. The idea of a water path across Central America between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans is very old. In 1513, a Spanish explorer named Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the narrow land in Panama. He became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the Americas. This showed the land connection was possible. Soon after, in 1534, the Spanish King Charles V ordered a study. He wanted to see if a canal could be built in Panama. The study found it was too difficult with the tools and knowledge available then. For the next 300 years, the idea mostly stayed an idea. Building a canal was too big and hard. Spain did not try seriously again. The land belonged to Spain until the early 1800s. Then the countries of Central America became independent. Interest in a canal grew again later in the 1800s. One big reason was the California gold rush starting in 1848. Many people from the east coast of the United States wanted to go to California quickly. Going by ship around South America took a very long time and was dangerous. A shorter route was needed. This led to the building of the Panama Railroad. Work started in 1850 and finished in 1855. It crossed the same narrow land in Panama. The railroad was very successful. It showed that crossing Panama was possible. It also made money by moving people and goods. The railroad proved that a major transportation link in Panama could work. It made people think a canal might also be possible. Around the same time, the United States and Great Britain signed an agreement in 1850. It was called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. This agreement said that if a canal was ever built in Central America, both countries would protect it. Neither country would control it alone. It would be neutral, meaning open to ships from all countries. The treaty did not say where the canal should be. It just said if one was built. People argued about the best place for a canal. Panama was one possibility. Another possibility was Nicaragua. Nicaragua had big lakes that might be used as part of a canal route. It seemed easier. Teams of engineers were sent to look at both places. They studied the land, the rivers, the rocks, and the weather. They tried to figure out where it would be easier and cheaper to dig a canal. They measured distances and heights. They looked at how much dirt and rock would need to be moved. They also thought about sickness in the hot, wet climate. These early surveys in Panama and Nicaragua were important. They collected basic information about the land. They showed that building a canal would be a huge job. It would cost a lot of money. It would need new machines and ways of working. It would also be very dangerous for workers because of diseases like malaria and yellow fever, which were common in the area. No one knew how to stop these diseases then. The idea of a canal was becoming more serious. The success of the Panama Railroad showed the value of a fast route. The political agreement between the U.S. and Britain removed one obstacle. The surveys gave some facts about the two main options, Panama and Nicaragua. But no one was ready to actually start building. It still seemed too big, too expensive, and too difficult. More studies were needed. Someone with a lot of money and confidence would need to take the risk. The dream of a canal across the Americas remained just a dream for a while longer. The land waited. The idea of building a canal through Panama gained serious attention in the late 19th century. After the success of the Suez Canal in Egypt, completed in 1869, many believed a similar project could connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French diplomat who led the Suez Project, became the main promoter of the Panama Canal idea. In 1879, an international congress met in Paris to discuss the canal project. De Lesseps pushed strongly for a sea-level canal, one without locks, through Panama, despite some engineers suggesting a lock system would be better. The Congress approved his plan, and the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interocéanique was created to build it. Work began in 1881 with great enthusiasm. The French brought modern equipment for that time: steam shovels, dredges, and railway systems to move dirt. However, they quickly encountered problems no one had fully anticipated. The tropical environment proved much harsher than in Egypt. Heavy rains caused constant landslides in the excavated areas, sometimes undoing months of work in minutes. The most serious challenge was disease. Malaria and yellow fever spread rapidly among workers. At first, no one understood these illnesses came from mosquitoes. Workers died in large numbers, sometimes hundreds in a single month. The French tried bringing in new workers from Europe and the Caribbean, but the death rate remained shockingly high. Engineering problems also mounted. The Culebra Cut, now called Gaillard Cut, where the canal needed to go through mountains, proved especially difficult. The rock was harder than expected, and landslides kept filling in the dugout areas. The French plan for a sea-level canal required removing much more material than originally calculated. Financial troubles began in 1885. The project was costing much more than planned, and progress was far slower than expected. De Lesseps kept asking investors for more money, claiming success was near. But by 1887, it became clear the sea-level plan wouldn't work. The company switched to a lock-based design, but it was too late. In 1889, the company ran out of money completely and went bankrupt. The project collapsed amid accusations of poor management and financial wrongdoing. About 20,000 workers had died during the French effort, mostly from disease. The company had spent nearly 1.5 billion francs, about $287 million then, but only completed about 40% of the excavation. The failure became a huge scandal in France known as the Panama Affair. De Lesseps and others were put on trial for fraud and mismanagement. The scandal hurt France's reputation and made investors wary of big international projects. However, the French effort wasn't completely wasted. They had built some infrastructure, completed important surveys, and excavated significant portions of the route. This work would later help the Americans when they took over the project. The French also left behind equipment and buildings that could be reused. The failed attempt taught important lessons. A sea-level canal wasn't practical in Panama. Disease control was absolutely necessary. Better organization and planning were needed. The project required much more money than originally thought. After the bankruptcy, a new French company took over the assets, but didn't continue construction. They mainly tried to keep the project alive long enough to sell it to another country. By the late 1890s, the United States became interested in taking over the canal project, seeing its potential for military and commercial use. The French period showed how difficult building the Panama Canal would be, but also proved it might be possible with better planning, more money, and solutions to the disease problems. The failed attempt scared away many investors, but paved the way for eventual success under American leadership. After the French failure, the canal project seemed dead. The French company kept its rights, but did no more work. For 10 years, nothing happened. Then, in the 1890s, the United States began looking seriously at building a canal. Two routes were possible, through Panama or through Nicaragua. A U.S. commission studied both places in 1899 to 1901. Panama had advantages. It was shorter, and the French had already done some work there. But Nicaragua had large lakes that could be part of the canal. The commission first favored Nicaragua. Then something changed their minds. Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a French engineer from the old canal company, worked hard to convince the Americans to choose Panama. He gave them information showing Nicaragua had volcanoes that could be dangerous. He also said Panama would be cheaper because of the French work already done there. In 1902, the U.S. Congress voted for Panama. The next problem was getting permission. Panama was then part of Colombia. The U.S. offered Colombia $10 million plus $250,000 yearly to allow the canal. In 1903, both countries signed the Hay-Heron Treaty, but Colombia's government refused to approve it. They wanted more money. This made Bunau-Varilla and some Panamanians angry. They saw the canal as good for Panama. With quiet support from the U.S. government, they planned to make Panama independent from Colombia. On November 3, 1903, the revolution happened. U.S. warships stopped Colombian troops from reaching Panama. Panama became independent in just 3 days with almost no fighting. The new Panama government quickly made a deal with the U.S. Bunau-Varilla, now representing Panama, signed the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty on November 18, 1903. This treaty gave the U.S. control of a 10-mile-wide canal zone forever, the right to build and run the canal, the right to protect the canal with military force. In return, Panama got $10 million and $250,000 per year. Many Panamanians later felt this treaty was unfair. The U.S. got much more than they had offered Colombia, but at the time, the new government accepted it. They needed U.S. support and wanted the canal built. With the treaty signed, the U.S. could now start work. They bought the French company's equipment and land for $40 million. This included the unfinished canal, buildings, railroads, and tools. The total cost so far was high, but less than starting from nothing. The U.S. government created the Isthmian Canal Commission to manage the project. They needed to decide how to build the canal. The French sea level plan had failed. Now engineers favored a lock canal, using dams to create lakes and locks to raise and lower ships. This would require less digging than cutting all the way through at sea level. Before construction could start, 2 big problems needed solving. Disease, malaria and yellow fever, still killed many people. Organization, the French effort had been poorly managed. The U.S. appointed John Findlay Wallace as the first chief engineer in 1904. But he faced many difficulties. The work sites were disorganized. Equipment from France was old or broken. Worker housing was inadequate. Worst of all, disease continued to kill many workers. After 1 year, little progress had been made. Many Americans began to doubt the project could succeed. Something needed to change. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt appointed a new chief engineer, John Stevens, and a new doctor, William Gorgas. These 2 men would transform the canal project. The events of 1903 were crucial. The quick revolution, the new treaty, and the U.S. takeover set the stage for successful construction. But major challenges remained. The next years would show whether the Americans could succeed where the French had failed. They needed to solve the disease problem, organize the massive project, and actually build the canal, all in one of the most difficult work environments in the world. The American effort to build the Panama Canal began slowly in 1904. The first year showed little progress as the new team faced the same problems that defeated the French. Workers continued dying from disease, equipment broke down frequently, and the tropical environment made work extremely difficult. The initial approach of continuing where the French left off proved unsuccessful. John Stevens became the new chief engineer in 1905 and changed everything. He understood that before any real construction could begin, the basic problems needed solving. The first priority was controlling the diseases that killed so many workers. Dr. William Gorgas received full support to implement his mosquito control program. Workers drained swamps where mosquitoes bred, sprayed oil on standing water, and installed screens in living quarters. These simple measures virtually eliminated yellow fever within a year and greatly reduced malaria cases. At the same time, Stevens improved living conditions for the workforce. He built proper housing with screened windows, established clean water systems, and created hospitals with trained medical staff. Cafeterias served tens of thousands of meals daily. These changes made Panama a safer place to work and attracted more laborers to the project. The workforce grew from a few thousand to over 30,000 at the project's peak. Stevens also made the crucial decision to abandon the French sea-level canal plan. Instead, he proposed using a system of locks and creating a large artificial lake. This required building a massive dam across the Chagres River to form Gatun Lake, which would serve as the canal's main waterway. Ships would be raised and lowered through 3 sets of locks at each end of the canal. This design significantly reduced the amount of excavation needed compared to the French approach. Actual construction began in earnest after these preparations. The work divided into several major components. Building the Gatun Dam required moving enormous amounts of earth and rock. The dam created what was then the world's largest artificial lake. Workers constructed the locks using concrete poured on site. The locks used a system of gates and chambers to raise and lower ships between sea level and the lake level. The most challenging section was the Culebra Cut, later renamed Gaillard Cut. This 8-mile stretch required digging through the Continental Divide. Workers used steam shovels and dynamite to remove rock and soil, which trains then carried away. The sides of the cut kept sliding down, requiring constant re-excavation. Engineers eventually solved this by making the slopes less steep. The project became highly organized under Stevens's leadership. Trains moved materials precisely where needed. Workshops repaired equipment around the clock. A telegraph system coordinated work across the entire canal zone. When Stevens unexpectedly resigned in 1907, President Roosevelt appointed Army engineer George Goethals to complete the project. Goethals maintained the efficient systems Stevens had established. By 1913, all major components were complete. The locks had been tested, Gatun Lake filled with water, and the Culebra Cut finally stabilized. On October 10, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson triggered the explosion that removed the last barrier between the oceans. The first official ship passed through the completed canal on August 15, 1914, just as World War I began in Europe. The American effort took 10 years and cost $375 million. About 5,600 workers died during construction, far fewer than during the French attempt. The completed canal stretched 50 miles from coast to coast. It included 3 main sets of locks at each end and the massive Gatun Lake in the middle. The minimum depth was 41 feet, allowing most ocean-going ships of the time to pass through. The Panama Canal's completion represented a major engineering achievement. Where the French had failed, the Americans succeeded through careful planning and systematic problem-solving. They first controlled the diseases that killed workers, then organized the massive project efficiently, and finally built the canal using practical engineering solutions. The canal immediately became vital for global shipping, providing a safe shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that changed world trade patterns permanently. The Panama Canal opened for business on August 15, 1914, but its early years of operation faced unexpected challenges. The timing coincided with the start of World War I in Europe, which immediately reduced international shipping traffic. Many commercial ships stayed in home waters due to wartime dangers, while naval vessels focused on military operations rather than using the new canal. This meant the canal's economic impact took several years to materialize fully. Initial operations revealed practical issues needing adjustment. The locks worked as designed, but required fine-tuning of procedures. Canal pilots needed time to develop expertise handling different ship types through the narrow channels. The original plan called for ships to pass through in about 12 hours, but early transits often took longer as crews adapted to the new system. Within a few years, the average transit time improved to about 8 hours as operations became more efficient. Maintenance emerged as a constant challenge. The tropical environment caused rapid wear on equipment. Saltwater corrosion affected metal parts, while humidity damaged electrical systems. The canal workforce transitioned from construction to maintenance roles, constantly repairing and replacing components. Landslides in the Culebra Cut remained a problem, requiring ongoing dredging to keep the channel clear. These operational realities made the canal more expensive to run than initially projected. Traffic through the canal grew steadily after the war ended in 1918. Shipping companies gradually adapted their routes to take advantage of the shorter passage. The canal particularly benefited trade between the U.S. East Coast and Asia, saving ships the long journey around South America. By the 1920s, about 5,000 ships were using the canal annually. This number would continue rising as global trade expanded. The canal's operation became a model of efficiency under U.S. management. A strict schedule ensured smooth traffic flow in both directions. Ships arrived at designated times and moved through the system without unnecessary delays. The canal employed about 4,000 workers during this period, many of whom lived in this canal zone with their families. The zone developed into a small American community with schools, hospitals, and recreational facilities. Relations between the U.S. and Panama showed early signs of strain during this period. Many Panamanians felt excluded from the economic benefits of the canal. The 1903 treaty gave the U.S. control over the canal zone, which became essentially American territory cutting through Panama. Disputes arose over wages for Panamanian workers and the zone's boundaries. These tensions would continue growing over the decades. Technological changes affected canal operations during the 1920s and 1930s. The shift from coal to oil-powered ships reduced the need for coaling stations in the zone. Larger ships began appearing, testing the canal's original size limits. The maximum ship size that could fit through became known as Panamax, setting a standard for shipbuilders worldwide. Some vessels had to be designed specifically to meet these size restrictions. The canal's military importance became clear during this period. U.S. naval ships could move quickly between oceans, strengthening American defense capabilities. The canal zone housed military bases that protected the waterway. This strategic value made the U.S. determined to maintain control, even as calls for Panamanian involvement grew louder. Economic changes in the 1930s affected canal traffic. The Great Depression reduced global trade, leading to fewer ships passing through. At the same time, competition emerged as some shipping lines found alternative routes more economical, despite being longer. These fluctuations showed that the canal's success depended on broader economic conditions beyond local control. By the late 1930s, the canal had settled into a stable operational routine. The initial technical problems had been solved, and traffic flows became predictable. However, new challenges loomed as ships continued growing larger and international tensions rose again in the lead-up to World War II. The canal's first quarter-century of operation proved its value, but also revealed limitations that would need addressing in future years. The stage was set for new developments as world conditions changed and technology advanced. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 changed the importance of the Panama Canal. As global conflict spread, the canal became a key military asset for the United States. The ability to move warships quickly between the Atlantic and Pacific was vital for defense. The U.S. government increased security along the canal, adding troops and anti-aircraft guns. Barbed wire fences appeared around critical areas. Blackout rules were enforced at night to protect against potential air attacks. Shipping traffic through the canal increased during the war years. Military vessels received priority, often causing delays for commercial ships. The canal workforce operated around the clock to keep the waterway open. Despite fears, no direct attacks occurred on the canal during the war. Its safe operation helped the Allied war effort by allowing rapid movement of ships and supplies between theaters of war. After the war ended in 1945, canal operations returned to normal. Commercial shipping traffic grew as global trade recovered. The U.S. maintained a strong military presence at the Canal Zone, which now included several bases. The zone had become a permanent American community, with schools, stores, and housing for workers and military families. Life in the zone followed American customs, creating a small piece of the U.S. in the middle of Panama. Relations between the U.S. and Panama grew more difficult during this period. Many Panamanians felt their country was not benefiting enough from the canal. The 1903 treaty gave Panama only a small annual payment, while the U.S. controlled the zone and collected all tolls. Protests became more common, with Panamanians arguing the treaty was unfair. In 1947, plans to establish new U.S. military bases outside the Canal Zone caused large protests, forcing the U.S. to abandon the idea. The 1950s saw rising nationalism in Panama. Students and workers held demonstrations demanding changes to the Canal Agreement. The most serious incident occurred in 1959 when Panamanians entered the Canal Zone to plant their national flag. U.S. troops stopped them, leading to violent clashes. These events showed growing frustration with American control of the canal. At the same time, the canal faced operational challenges. Ship sizes continued increasing, with some vessels barely fitting through the locks. Maintenance costs rose as the infrastructure aged. The original locks, now over 40 years old, needed constant repairs. Engineers began studying ways to modernize the canal to handle larger ships, but no major improvements were made during this period. The U.S. government made small changes to address Panamanian concerns. In 1955, a new treaty increased the annual payment to Panama and gave Panamanian workers in the zone better wages. However, the key issue of sovereignty over the canal zone remained unresolved. Panamanian leaders continued pushing for greater control over the waterway running through their country. By the end of the 1950s, it was clear the status quo could not last. The original 1903 treaty had been made when Panama was a newly independent nation, with little bargaining power. Now, with decolonization movements growing worldwide and Panama's economy developing, demands for change became stronger. The stage was set for difficult negotiations about the canal's future. The canal itself continued operating efficiently during these years. Traffic steadily increased, and toll revenue grew. The waterway had become essential for global trade, particularly for oil shipments from Alaska and goods moving between the U.S. East Coast and Asia. But political pressures and physical limitations both signaled that changes would be necessary in the coming decades. The question was no longer whether the canal would change, but how and when those changes would happen. During these 2 decades, the Panama Canal remained under firm U.S. control, but the foundations of that control were weakening. The military importance shown during World War II gave way to commercial dominance in peacetime, while political challenges from Panama grew steadily stronger. The next years would see these tensions lead to major changes in the canal's management and ownership. The 1960s marked the start of major changes in the Panama Canal's ownership and operation. Growing political pressure from Panama forced the United States to reconsider its control of the waterway. In 1960, President Dwight Eisenhower took the first step by ordering the Panamanian flag to be flown alongside the American flag in the canal zone. This small symbolic gesture acknowledged Panama's claims over the territory. 4 years later, a more serious conflict erupted. In January 1964, Panamanian students entered the canal zone to raise their flag at a high school. A scuffle broke out with American students, leading to riots that spread across Panama City. The violence lasted 4 days, leaving more than 20 Panamanians and 4 Americans dead. The incident became known as Martyrs' Day in Panama and forced both countries to address the canal issue seriously. Negotiations began in 1965 but progressed slowly. The main sticking point was Panama's demand for full control of the canal, while the U.S. wanted to maintain operational authority. Talks stalled several times as neither side would compromise on these core positions. Meanwhile, the canal continued operating normally, with traffic increasing each year as global trade expanded. A breakthrough came in 1974 when the U.S. agreed to negotiate new treaties that would eventually transfer the canal to Panama. The talks lasted nearly 3 years, facing opposition from American conservatives who believed the U.S. should keep the canal permanently. In Panama, some groups demanded immediate transfer without conditions. The negotiations finally produced results in 1977 when President Jimmy Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos signed 2 new treaties. The first treaty stated the canal would be transferred to Panama on December 31, 1999. The second guaranteed the canal's permanent neutrality, allowing all nations to use it peacefully. The U.S. Senate narrowly approved the treaties after heated debate, with many senators concerned about giving up American control. Implementation of the treaties began in 1979. The Canal Zone ceased to exist as a U.S. territory, with most land returned to Panama. A new agency called the Panama Canal Commission took over canal operations, with joint American-Panamanian management. The transition period aimed to prepare Panama for full control by training local workers and transferring technical knowledge. During these years, the canal faced operational challenges. The waterway's infrastructure was aging, with some components over 60 years old. Maintenance costs rose as engineers worked to keep the original locks functioning. Shipping patterns changed as container ships grew larger, with many now too big for the canal's dimensions. Some business was lost to alternative routes, though the canal remained vital for certain trades. The political changes affected the thousands of Americans living and working in the former canal zone. Many chose to leave as U.S. government jobs were phased out. Schools and military bases began closing, marking the end of the American community that had existed since 1904. Panama took over these facilities, converting some for new uses while others were abandoned. Economic studies during this period examined the canal's future under Panamanian control. Experts predicted the waterway could remain profitable if properly maintained and modernized. However, questions remained about Panama's ability to manage such a complex operation without American expertise. The transition period was designed to address these concerns through training and shared management. By the end of the 1970s, the process of transferring the canal was underway, but far from complete. The next 2 decades would determine whether Panama could successfully take over this engineering marvel that had been under American control for 75 years. The treaties had set the course, but many practical challenges remained before the final handover at the century's end. The Panama Canal operates as a vital pathway for global shipping. It is managed entirely by the Panama Canal Authority, an organization belonging to the government of Panama. Following the completion of the major expansion project in 2016, the canal possesses the capability to accommodate significantly larger ships. These very large ships are categorized under the term Neo-Panamax. Neo-Panamax vessels can transport substantially greater quantities of cargo, including standard shipping containers, bulk commodities like grain, and specialized shipments such as liquefied natural gas, LNG. The original, smaller locks constructed during the initial building phase over a century ago continue to function reliably. They operate alongside the newer, much larger locks that were added during the recent expansion project. This dual system allows the canal to serve a wider variety of vessel sizes and types efficiently. The canal's fundamental purpose remains providing a crucial shortcut. It creates a direct link between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This link saves ships an immense amount of time and distance compared to the alternative route, sailing around the southernmost point of South America, Cape Horn. That southern route is not only much longer, but also poses greater risks due to challenging weather and sea conditions. Statistics indicate that approximately 6% of the world's total cargo ship movements utilize the Panama Canal annually. This represents a significant portion of international trade volume. Each year, the canal facilitates the transit of many thousands of ships. The goods transported through the canal are diverse. encompassing manufactured products packed in shipping containers, automobiles and other vehicles, various fuels including crude oil, refined petroleum products, and liquefied natural gas, agricultural products such as grains and soybeans, and raw materials like coal. Ships registered in or carrying cargo destined for the United States, China, Chile, and Japan are among the most frequent users of the canal route. The operation of the canal generates substantial revenue for the nation of Panama. The fees collected from shipping companies for using the canal constitute a major component of Panama's national income and government budget. The calculation of these transit fees is based primarily on the size of the vessel and the type of cargo it is carrying. For the largest Neo-Panamax ships, particularly container carriers and LNG tankers, the fee for a single transit can reach several $100,000. This significant income stream is vital for Panama's overall economy. It funds not only the ongoing operation and maintenance of the canal itself, but also contributes financially to other national development projects and public services across the country. Ensuring the smooth and reliable operation of the canal involves addressing persistent challenges. A primary concern is the management of water resources. The canal relies heavily on fresh water, primarily sourced from the artificial Lake Gatun, to fill the lock chambers each time a ship is raised or lowered during its transit. Lake Gatun is replenished almost entirely by rainfall within its surrounding watershed. Periods of significantly reduced rainfall, known as droughts, cause the water level in Lake Gatun to decline. When the lake level drops too low, the Canal Authority faces difficult decisions. It may become necessary to impose restrictions on the total number of ships permitted to transit each day. Alternatively, or additionally, the authority might enforce draft restrictions, limiting how deeply laden ships can be, how much cargo they can carry, to prevent them from running aground in the shallower water. These restrictions inevitably cause delays in shipping schedules and increase operational costs for shipping lines. Consequently, finding effective methods to reduce water consumption per lockage cycle and to enhance water storage capacity is a continuous operational priority. The newer locks incorporate a water-saving basin system designed to reuse a portion of the water from each lockage, which helps mitigate this challenge, but does not eliminate it. Maintaining the required depth and width of the navigation channels is another constant operational task. Natural processes cause soil, silt, and sediment to erode from the land surrounding the canal and gradually accumulate within the channels. To counteract this, large specialized vessels called dredgers work regularly to remove this accumulated material. This dredging is essential to ensure the channels remain deep enough and wide enough for the safe passage of large vessels, especially the deep-draft Neo-Panamax ships. Furthermore, the mechanical components of the lock gates, the valves controlling water flow, the locomotives, mules that guide ships, and the associated infrastructure all require ongoing inspection, routine maintenance, and periodic repairs to prevent malfunctions and ensure continuous, safe operation. This maintenance work is a fundamental, non-stop aspect of canal management. Competition from alternative global shipping routes presents an external challenge. Other major maritime passages exist. The Suez Canal in Egypt offers a primary route connecting Asia and Europe. Economic factors, such as fluctuations in fuel prices, toll costs at different canals, and specific world events impacting specific regions, influence shipping companies' decisions. Sometimes, for certain voyages, particularly those originating in Asia and heading to Europe or the U.S. East Coast, the Suez Canal route might offer a shorter distance, lower overall cost, or faster transit time compared to the Panama route. Shifts in global trade patterns, such as changes in manufacturing locations or consumer demand centers, also affect the volume and direction of cargo flows potentially using the Panama Canal. Therefore, the Canal Authority must consistently focus on maintaining high levels of operational efficiency, reliability, and competitive pricing to retain its existing users and attract new shipping traffic. Proposals for constructing entirely new canals, such as one across Nicaragua, have surfaced periodically, but none have progressed beyond the planning stage due to immense financial, environmental, and technical hurdles. Additionally, the potential for shorter Arctic shipping routes, facilitated by reduced sea ice due to climate change, exists. However, the viability, safety, and year-round reliability of these northern routes remain highly uncertain and are unlikely to challenge the Panama Canal significantly in the near or medium term. Weather patterns and the broader issue of climate change introduce further complexity and risk. Changes in climate may result in more frequent or severe periods of drought within the canal's watershed, directly threatening the water supply in Lake Gatun. Conversely, increased intensity of storms or heavy rainfall events can cause flooding, landslides into the channels, or necessitate temporary closures for safety. Managing the water resources of Lake Gatun involves a delicate balance. The lake must provide sufficient water for the canal's lock operations, while also serving as a crucial source of drinking water and water for agriculture for the population living in the nearby regions. Protecting the forests and natural vegetation within the canal's watershed is critically important. These forests help regulate the flow of rainwater, reduce soil erosion that leads to sedimentation in the lake and channels, and contribute to maintaining water quality. The Canal Authority engages in watershed management programs to support this environmental protection. Looking towards the future, the Panama Canal Authority is committed to sustained investment in the waterway. This involves allocating significant financial resources for the upkeep, repair, and modernization of the existing infrastructure, both the original locks and the newer expansion locks, as well as the channels and support facilities. Potential future projects could explore further technological or operational improvements aimed at enhancing water efficiency, increasing transit capacity where feasible, or improving resilience against climate impacts. The overarching objective is to ensure the Panama Canal remains a competitive, reliable, and indispensable link within the global maritime transportation network for decades to come. The canal is deeply intertwined with Panama's national identity and economic well-being. It continues to function as a vital connection point in international trade, requiring continuous adaptation to accommodate evolving ship sizes, changing global trade routes, and the escalating challenges presented by a changing environment. Its successful operation demands relentless attention to management, maintenance, and forward-looking planning.